Let's get into our next conversation now. So the question is, what is public debt? Now, public debt is a liability on the part of the government, and it requires servicing and repayment. Well, Nigeria's public debt stock rose from 35.46 trillion naira, that's about $86.57 billion in the second quarter of 2021, to 42.84 trillion naira. That's about 103.31 billion US dollars in the second quarter of 2022. This is according to the National Bureau of Statistics report in its Nigerian domestic and foreign debt report for the second quarter of last year and second quarter of this year, released in Abuja recently, capturing both external and domestic debt. The NBA stated that while external debt stood at 13.71 trillion in the second quarter of 2021 and increased to 16.61 trillion in the second quarter of 2022, domestic debt was 21.75 trillion in the second quarter of last year, but increased to 26.23 trillion naira in the second quarter of 2022. This has raised fresh concerns again about the healthy nature of the country's borrowing approach. Now let's get talking now, shall we? For further analysis now, Mr. Vayela Kwaga is a senior research analyst at Budget Foundation. He joins us virtually. Thank you for finding time to join us again. Good morning. Hello, Mr. Vayela. Well, I guess we're finding it difficult now.
Thank you for having me.
Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes. Can you hear me?
You. Yes. I can hear you now. Thank you for your time.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, so Nigeria's total debt stock jumped to 42.84 trillion naira. That's about 103.3 billion US dollars as of June this year. So this figure captured both external and domestic debt. So help us make sense of this. External debt and domestic debt. Is the difference? What's the difference, and what are the implications of each of these?
External debt and domestic debt, as the names imply, mean monies that have been borrowed from financiers on the international markets, while domestic debt is monies that have been borrowed from financiers within the country. And it has
I guess we're struggling to hear you, Mr. Vayela. Can you hear me now?
The management of
okay.
Because the government has some money. It's been uninterrupted at my end.
Okay, go ahead, please.
Yes. So the implications for external debts will definitely affect the amount of money the government will be able to spend on governance, on personnel, on overheads, and on capital expenditure, because it will have to pay back these external debts in dollars, as the terms of the contract or as the terms of the loan provide. In addition, the government will also have to pay interest in dollars, and the problem becomes worse or is exacerbated where inflation ravages the naira. So you have the naira losing value, and you have these interest rate payments and the principals, broadening or increasing.
Just pardon me so that we can, take this conversation step by step.
The same goes for the.
Can you hear me, Mr. Vayela? I don't know if you can hear me, but I just...
Yes, I can hear you loud and clear.
Yes, so I wanted to come in here to ask you, you talked about the implication of external debt is the amount, the limit of amount that the government can spend per time, considering, what that fund is meant for. Of course, understandably so, that the government is aware of the implication of this, but the government has continued to borrow, because according to the government, the only way it can sustain the economy, talking about infrastructure and all of that, is to continue to borrow. Given the implication that the exchange rate has continued to rise, I mean, how does it affect the country more when the government knows the implication of what it borrows?
So there are problems with borrowing depending on the fiscal context. Where you have a buoyant economy, where the government is able to efficiently and effectively acquire revenue, whether they be from oil or non-oil, the government would be seen as a going concern. Nigeria as a state is a corporation, can be seen as a corporation. And where investors see that the country is doing well financially, they'll be very, very willing to provide, loans and, monies for the government to borrow. But where the country is not productive, where it is struggling to collect revenues, where it is struggling to raise revenues, where the international financiers see that it losing large amounts of money due to corruption and leakages in the budget and in governance, their faith or their trust or their confidence in Nigeria as a corporation will definitely reduce. So the federal government is battling with this image, and though it has not really affected its ability to borrow, because the euro bonds, I read quite recently that Nigeria is considering taking on some new euro bonds and approaching the IMF for another facility relating to food security. So I don't think that the major financiers have any problems, though you would have lots of private ones that might be more skeptical. But by and large, you see that, or you find out that there's a huge implication on governance, where the government continues to borrow, because those debt repayment obligations will not go anywhere, and inflation will constantly erode the value of the naira, leaving less and less available for capital projects, for infrastructure, to pay salaries, personnel, to cater to overhead costs, and more would be directed to paying off these debts.
Why do you think the government needs to be careful when it comes to spending? How cautious is the government is or has to be when it comes to spending? Because there's a school of thought, or economic theories, that sometimes if the government wants to boost the economy, he has to spend more. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Yes. So go ahead. Talk to us about that.
So, this is what they call neo-Keynesian economics.
Just before you answer that question, I want us to take a look at this figure. Talking about the public debt right now, Nigeria's debt profile at the second quarter of 2022, you will discover that external debt in the first quarter of 2021 was around 13.71 trillion naira, but in the second quarter of 2023 it has increased to 16.61 trillion naira. That means that the government is incurring more debt, as it were. Domestic debt in this first quarter of 2021 is at 21.75 trillion naira, and 2022 now in the second quarter is 26.23 trillion naira. Now, so the second question will be, so that you can treat it together, how healthy is this? When you compare the figures now between the external debt and the domestic debt, and the figure, how it has jumped from 21.75 trillion naira in the first quarter of 2021 to 26.23 trillion naira. How healthy is it for a country like Nigeria that barely can meet a revenue target?
It's very, very unhealthy. As a matter of fact, we are caught between the devil and the deep blue sea. We have very, very important and crucial requirements for spending. Nigeria is a nation of over 200 million people, so your guess is as good as mine that the amount of goods and services in terms of health, in terms of education, in terms of agriculture, in terms of infrastructure, in terms of security, in terms of justice are enormous, and they will continue to grow. especially seeing that Nigeria has a youthful population. It will mean that a lot of this infrastructure, a lot of these goods and services needed will probably even expand. That demand will expand as this youthful population grows older and puts more pressure on government resources. On the other hand, the government needs money urgently and cannot wait, in quotes, for the economy to become productive overnight. It must do something. And this is the problem, where you have a country that was unable to appropriately manage its economy, work on its inflation, improve the ease of doing business parameters. And this is a governance problem that is not just a federal issue, but also a state problem. And plug the leakages in the budgeting process and drive down corruption to very, very minimal levels, allowing the markets to thrive and improving on its domestic resource acquisition capabilities. And I'm talking about, collecting taxes and what have you. We also have oil, but unfortunately, Nigeria has been unable to save enough. While some administrations were able to put some money into savings, other administrations have been borrowing, in trillions, as you have just mentioned. So the implications for the financial health of the country are dire, and it's not easy to confront the fact that Nigeria has these urgent governance needs. But at the same time, something has to be done. It's better to do something than nothing. So in some way, we cannot be entirely critical of the government, seeing as ramping up or improving the economy are things that do not happen overnight. But by and large, looking at the rate of borrowing, the government does need to work on plugging its revenue leakages, on driving down the cost of governance. And this is something, these are arguments that should be made to both federal and state governments.
Now, I was asking you earlier, at what point does the government have to be cautious when it comes to spending to boost the economy?
It has to be cautious at every single point. And, you are making reference to neo-Keynesianism, which assumes that for a government to approach an expansionary fiscal policy, it spends a lot to improve, revenues. And a contractionary fiscal policy, it spends little because there is excess liquidity, in the economy. The problem with Nigeria, I think, at the moment is we're having two problems happening at the same time. Government.
Hello, Mr. Viola. Can you hear me?
Or
yes.
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, go ahead.
May I go on?
Yes, go ahead, please.
So the government wants to spend in order to boost, economic activity, but the country is already suffering from double-digit inflation. As a matter of fact, from 2015 till now, Nigeria has been experiencing double-digit inflation for every single year from 2015 to 2022, and it would likely peak in 2023, seeing as there was an injection of over 20 trillion through the ways and means advances by the central bank to the government. So the government does need to be cautious. But again, Nigerians will always bring it to the fore that there is an excessive amount of wastage that goes on in government. There's an excessive amount of money that is lost through corruption. And these are things that we think that the government needs to take more seriously. The president, in his budget speech, did note that they were considering pursuing a budget act that would provide a yearly allowance for the government to cap certain or to create certain fiscal requirements in terms of levies, in terms of taxes that the tax authorities would be collecting. And I think that is actually a very good way to go. Again, the Budget Office has streamlined and improved the process of budgeting by the MDAs, making it such that there is more control and oversight that the budget office has to control how MDAs drop their budgets and, use these monies. And for those MDAs that are meant to remit monies to the government, there is now a quarterly remittance schedule that makes the collection process from these state-owned enterprises much more efficient. So in summary, I would say that while there has to be caution in spending, the government needs to do two things. It needs to promptly drive down inflation in order to bring back the value of the naira.
As we wind down now, just a moment, as we wind down now, so let's wrap it up on that note. Yes, this is a pre-election year. Some people expect that, the inflation will get worse. I mean, in the coming month. I mean, even in the real election year. So what are your expectations? Because you talked about the fact that the government has to start looking for a way to drive down inflation. How possible is that? Let's wrap it up on that note.
Yeah, I mean, it is very possible. And this is where fiscal policy and monetary policy come in. The monetary policy is the tool of the central bank in terms of reducing the amounts of liquidity in the economy. And I think the Minister of Finance made some comments about bond buybacks. And this has to be done in tandem with the central bank. By that, you would have some creation of liability management, or let me put it that way, there will be better liability management on the part of the government. But where the government buys back these bonds, it will be injecting more money into the system, because bonds are simply the exchange of money for a certificate that the government owes you this amount at a certain period. So where the government decides to buy its bonds back, it's going to be increasing, the excess liquidity that is causing and affecting inflation. Another means is through fiscal policy, which is sorry?
Yeah, yes. I thought you wanted to, wrap it up there. Go ahead, please. If you can do that in 30 seconds.
Yeah, in summary, the Ministry of Finance also needs to work closely with the monetary authorities to ensure that there's a unified front in fiscal and monetary policy in driving down inflation, because there's very, very little time and the demands of governance are growing by the day.
Okay, I think we'll have to leave it there. Thank you so much, Viola Kwaga, Senior Research Analyst at Budget Foundation. Thank you for your time today on the program. We appreciate you.
Thanks. Yeah, bye-bye.
Yeah.